Originally introduced in 2006's Time Spiral, Split Second is an incredibly powerful mechanic, mostly because it entirely freezes one of the most important aspects of Magic, the stack. Normally, the stack is made up of spells and abilities from both players, and it can be added to at any time, provided a player has a legal spell or ability to cast, and then once both players are done, everything resolves. Not so with Split Second. When a card with this keyword is on the stack, players can't cast spells or activate abilities that aren't mana abilities. That means that a Split Second card resolves no matter what, because counter magic can't be used on them, and it means your opponent can't do anything in response before it resolves either. All of that power has made Split Second a little used but incredibly powerful mechanic. There are only 22 cards in Magic with the keyword, and 17 of them, that is, all but 5, have achieved at least one top 8 at a major Magic event. In this video, we'll look at the 10 Split Second cards that have left the biggest impact on competitive Magic. This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. Use the links in the description to visit their store. Before we get started, here's a quick reminder on how I rank cards in these videos. A first tier top 8 is worth 2 points. This includes events like Pro Tours, and a second tier top 8 is worth 1 point. This includes events like regional championships. At number 10, it's Sudden Substitution. For 2 generic and 2 blue, it's an instant that lets you exchange control of target non-creature spell and target creature. Then the spell's controller may choose new targets for it. It's pretty nice this spell has Split Second, as it's the kind of thing that could be easily disrupted, since it requires both a non-creature spell on the stack and a creature in play. It was printed in Commander 2019, so the only 60-card formats it's legal in are Legacy and Vintage. While you might be thinking that this would primarily be used to give up a creature token to gain control of a super powerful spell, that isn't really how it's been used in 60-card formats. Instead, it's played in Legacy Hivemind decks. These decks look to cast a pact, like Slaughter Pact with Hivemind in play. All of the pacts make it so the person who resolves it has to pay mana on their next turn or lose the game, and if you have Hivemind in play, your opponent is forced to copy a pact when you cast it. Sudden Substitution gives the deck some redundancy, because it also lets you force your opponent to cast a pact without Hivemind around. Substitution is likely to gain some points in Legacy going forward, though it isn't like Hivemind decks are the dominant deck in the format or anything. Still, some of the cards on this list are inactive, and it may pass them in the future. At number 9, it's Sudden Death. For 1 generic and 2 black, it gives a creature -4/-4 until end of turn. This is a pretty decent removal spell even without Split Second, but the keyword makes it substantially better. Anytime you're using removal that doesn't straight up destroy, you risk your opponent finding a way to buff their creature in response to blink the spell, but they can't do that with Sudden Death, nor can they respond by sacrificing the creature or using an ability for value before the creature dies. This led to Sudden Death seeing regular play in block and standard between 2007 and 2008, and it even picked up a modern top 8 in 2015, although it was never heavily played in any of those formats, and it could lose its spot on the list in the future. At number 8, it's Take Possession. For 5 generic and 2 blue, it's an enchantment aura with enchant permanent, and it lets you gain control of the enchanted permanent. Adding Split Second to the mix means that your opponent really has no say in the matter, and that's good, because if you're paying 7 mana for this effect and your opponent sacrifices their creature, gives it hexproof, or even taps it to use an ability, you're not going to be very happy. It saw significant play in block, standard, and extended, where it was usually played in control decks. One of the wackier decks it was played in was Extended Enduring Ideal, a deck that looked to resolve that big epic spell and tutor up really expensive enchantments every turn, and obviously Take Possession is going to be sweet when you're doing that. However, Take Possession doesn't have any points since 2008. At number 7, it's Legolas's Quick Reflexes. For 1 green mana, this instant untaps a creature and gives it hexproof until end of turn, and anytime that creature becomes tapped that turn, it deals damage equal to its power to up to 1 target creature. Having a hexproof spell with Split Second is pretty great, because you know for sure that you're going to stop whatever it is that's targeting your creature. Add to the mix the fact that this lets a creature damage other creatures, and we're talking about a pretty sweet removal spell too. Because this is a card from the Lord of the Rings Commander set, the only 60-card formats it's legal in are Legacy and Vintage, but it's proven to be plenty strong even for Magic's most powerful formats. In Legacy, it's played in decks that are reliant on having 1 creature win the game for you. This makes it the most common in decks like Dark Depths and Infect. Protecting your massive Merit Lage token and turning it into a removal spell is pretty sweet. In Vintage, it's played in Bizarre aggro decks, which put about 5 creatures onto the battlefield on turn 1, and keeping that damage on the table is important to win the game quickly. Reflexes helps you get blockers out of the way, and blank removal. It looks well positioned to keep gaining points in the Eternal formats. It's just so cheap and so powerful that it's hard to imagine that green decks in those formats will stop playing it in the future. At number 6, it's Sudden Shock. For 1 generic and 1 red mana, it does what the name implies. It's Shock, but with Split Second. Paying 2 mana for 2 damage isn't usually an ideal rate, but like with Sudden Death, when you cast Sudden Shock, you don't have to worry about your opponent buffing or sacrificing their creature in response. If that thing has 2 or less toughness when Sudden Shock is on the stack, it's dead. No questions asked. In Block and Extended, it was largely played in aggro decks. In Modern, Legacy, and Vintage, it's been more of a sideboard card. There are some particularly pesky creatures in those formats who are pretty problematic if their opponent can respond to your removal, like Arcbound Ravager, Knight of the Reliquary, and Scavenging Ooze, and it's also nice to be able to take down Delver of Secrets no matter how much counter magic its controller has. Sudden Shock hasn't put up any points since 2018 though, so it's unlikely to move higher on the list. At number 5, it's Wipe Away. For 1 generic and 2 blue, it's an instant that bounces a permanent. Note, by the way, that it does not say non-land permanent like most cards do, so you can even use this to go after a land. This is yet another interactive card with Split Second that makes sure you get to interact how you want to when you cast it. It only saw a little bit of play in Standard, but it's a common sideboard card in Modern, where it often appears in Storm decks. You can use it to bounce a land at the end of your opponent's turn if you're worried about them interacting when you try to go off. It's also a common sideboard card in Sneak and Show decks in Legacy. These decks lean pretty heavily on Show and Tell, a card that lets both players put something into play for free. In the mirror especially, that can be a pretty big problem since you don't really want your opponent also putting a big scary creature into play. Wipe Away makes sure you get rid of that creature, no questions asked. Wipe Away is likely to put up more top 8s in the future. At number 4, it's Sulfur Elemental. The only creature with Split Second to make the list. It's 2 generic and a red for a 3/2 with Flash, and it gives white creatures +1/-1. Flashing a creature in that always resolves is pretty sweet, especially if you can kill a bunch of X1s with it. It saw some significant play in Block and Standard, where it was often played in the main deck of mono red decks, since weakening or killing small white creatures often allowed them to attack more effectively. It's also seen significant play in both Legacy and Vintage. In both formats, it's particularly good against Monastery Mentor, a super powerful card that many decks look to win the game with. It gets rid of its pesky prowess tokens with ease. Sulfur Elemental is still seeing play in the Eternal formats, and it's going to keep putting up top 8s. At number 3, it's Angel's Grace. For 1 white mana, this instant makes it so you can't lose the game and your opponent can't win the game until end of turn, and any damage that would reduce your life total less than 1 reduces it to 1 instead. That is a lot of power for a single mana, but it is super situational. It's not the kind of card every deck can use consistently, so it didn't see much play in Block, Standard, or Extended. However, Angel's Grace has seen plenty of play in Modern, Legacy, and Vintage. In Modern and Legacy, it's usually played in Ad Nauseam decks. Ad Nauseam is a card which lets you draw your entire library if you want to, provided you lose life for the mana value of each card you draw. If you cast Angel's Grace and then Ad Nauseam, you don't really have to worry about losing all that life. You just draw your whole deck and then win with Thassa's Oracle. In Vintage, Angel's Grace largely sees play as a sideboard card that can be brought in against decks looking to win the game with Thassa's Oracle, which in Vintage is usually a Doomsday deck. Doomsday is a card that lets you get rid of most of your deck, except for the Oracle and a few other cards, so that you can win the game with the trigger really easily. But if you cast Angel's Grace in response, that trigger won't be winning them the game, and they're just going to lose on their next turn because they don't have any library left. Angel's Grace is going to keep on putting up points, but the top 2 on this list have a big lead and are also still seeing play. At number 2, it's Extirpate. For 1 black mana, it's an instant that lets you choose a card in a graveyard other than a basic land, then you search its owner's graveyard, hand, and library for all cards that have the same name, and exile them. This is a great way to hit on the graveyard, in large part thanks to Split Second. While it doesn't exile a whole graveyard or anything like that, it can sometimes be better, since it lets you strip every copy of one specific card out of your opponent's deck and hand. You don't have to worry about your opponent finding a way to stop you either, like by reanimating the creature you target or something like that. It saw a good amount of play in Time Spiral Block, a format that was dominated by Mystical Teachings decks. Extirpate could hate on the graveyard by removing the powerful flashback card while also taking away every other copy your opponent has, which went a long way towards derailing those decks. In Extended, it was played in decks like Gifts Ungiven, Psychotog, and Life from the Loam. All three of those decks were very focused on using their namesakes, and they all sought to load up the graveyard, making Extirpate particularly potent against them. And in Legacy and Vintage, it's often used against Reanimator decks. It's going to keep hating on graveyards in multiple formats. And at number 1, it's Frozen Grip. For 2 generic and a green, it's an instant that destroys an artifact or enchantment. So you pay 1 more mana for Naturalize, but it's worth it since your opponent can do nothing to prevent themselves from losing the artifact or enchantment that you target. While it has found success in multiple formats, Legacy is by far where it's been played the most. There are a number of artifacts played in that format with really obnoxious abilities that could normally be used in response to most Naturalize effects. Your opponent not being able to bounce their Batter Skull, activate their Goblin Charbelcher, or remove counters from Walking Ballista in response to Frozen Grip is great. Back in the day, it was also really good against Sensei's Divining Top before that card got banned, because that was also a very impossible to interact with artifact. As long as there are pesky artifacts and enchantments with activated abilities, Frozen Grip is going to be good in Legacy, and it's going to continue to put up points there, so I think it's going to be the number 1 split-second card in Magic for the foreseeable future. So, those are the best split-second cards in Magic. If you're tired of your opponent responding to your spells, check out the description, where you can find direct Card Kingdom links for all the split-second cards that appeared in this video. If you want to make sure you catch future videos, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. And if you want to catch up on past top 10s, including many more that look at specific keyword abilities and mechanics, check out my MTG Top 10 playlists. Thanks for watching.